For 500 years, our little island Britain has punched above its weight around the world, getting our way. The means to our success, not just gunboats and commerce, but ruthless power broking, Machiavellian manoeuvring, and plenty of charm. Diplomacy.
Diplomats are the people you don't often get to hear about. It's the kings and queens, the politicians and the generals who dominate the history books. But this series is about my predecessors who championed Britain's interests abroad. Ambassadors and envoys, power brokers and negotiators.
You must never forget that it's British interests which you're there to promote and protect.
You are constantly having to talk to, make deals with, make concessions to, people who in other ways you are doing things which you thoroughly dislike and disapprove of.
The worst kind of diplomat is one who tells his foreign secretary what he thinks the minister wants to hear.
As our man in Washington, I saw history in the making. Now I'm going back in time, putting myself in the shoes of different diplomats over the last 200 years, dealing with China. Their job, fighting for British prosperity.
Our economic well-being is as much a part of the national interest as the defence of the realm. Wherever we're sent in the world, we diplomats look out for British trade and for British business. As Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid.
The days of being snooty about business and not getting one's hands dirty with business, they're long past.
Promoting British trade is one of the very few useful things the Foreign Office does.
On the 26th of September, 1792, an extraordinary diplomatic expedition set off from Britain. Its leader was George Macartney, a well-connected Anglo-Irish aristocrat.
Good afternoon.
Macartney had already gained wide diplomatic experience in Russia, India, and the Caribbean. He'd even suffered the misfortune of being taken prisoner by the French. I was once detained for an hour or so in a Soviet police station, but that's another story. Macartney's task was to use diplomacy to prise open trade for Britain with an even bigger empire. He was to be our very first ambassador to China.
Terrific. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks. Bye. It all boiled down to this. In the 18th century, a new craze for drinking tea had poured across Britain, starting in the fashionable drawing rooms of the aristocracy, where chinoiserie was all the rage, and in the end becoming a beverage around which almost everybody shaped their day. The British national drink was made in China. And so, of course, was much of the finest China. Cups and saucers and so on. And it didn't come cheap.
By the 1790s, the British were drinking some 20 million pounds of Chinese tea each year. The Chinese would accept only gold or silver as payment, and British coffers were fast running out. To pay for our tea, Macartney's task was to persuade China to start buying British goods.
The father of modern economics, Adam Smith, wrote in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, "To found a great empire for the sole purpose of raising up a people of customers may at first sight appear a project fit only for a nation of shopkeepers. It is, however, a project extremely fit for a nation whose government is influenced by shopkeepers."
Trade was at the heart of British identity at the end of the 18th century. A rapidly industrializing and voraciously consuming nation, extending its reach across the world. Over Over the waves that Britain ruled sailed merchantmen packed to the gunwales with goods and slaves. We sold in Cape Town what we had bought in Calcutta, we bought in Jamaica what we'd sell in Europe. Inspired by Adam Smith, Britain built an empire on the principle of mutually advantageous trade among nations. But unfortunately for Macartney, Confucius had never read Adam Smith. After 9 long months at sea, the British mission finally reached China. Macartney was intrigued by all he saw and told the mission's own artists to sketch everything in sight. The British were just as much objects of curiosity to the Chinese. They stuck out a mile in their tailored European trousers and were nicknamed devils, since in Chinese theatre, only devils wore tight clothes.
These days, when you get a new diplomatic posting, you usually get enough time to learn about the country you're going to. Poor old Macartney didn't get that opportunity. In 1793, there wasn't a single person in the whole of Britain who could speak a word of Chinese. And the only Englishman who had tried to go on a diplomatic mission to China had died on the way. So though he read as much as he could in preparation, Macartney was totally unprepared for the culture shock that awaited him. He might as well have come from another planet.
Qing dynasty China discouraged all contact with foreigners. There were no permanent foreign ambassadors, and trade with Western merchants was tightly controlled, limited to the port of Canton.
The Chinese believed that they were the center of the world and that foreigners were essentially lesser people who were barbarians. They came to pay tribute. They were allowed to trade up to a point, but only up to a point. And Britain, becoming the biggest trading nation in the world, naturally believed in free trade, that all markets should be open and that countries should deal with each other equally, that we should have an ambassador in Peking whose main object would be to promote trade. And so there was a complete lack of understanding of the fundamental ideas.
When at last Macartney's expedition arrived in Beijing, they were overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of people. But their journey still wasn't over. Macartney must have felt the truth of the old Chinese saying, "Heaven is high, the emperor distant," when he found that the Emperor Qianlong had decamped to his summer retreat in the cool mountains of the north. As the weary party travelled northwards, a row was brewing over a tricky question of etiquette.
Even in the age of globalization, every country clings to its protocol, to its rites and rituals, which foreign diplomats ignore at their peril. Get the protocol wrong, where to stand, when to speak, how to address the president or the monarch, and you can blight your mission before it's even started.
And in China, protocol really mattered. Macartney had been informed that when he arrived in court, he must perform the Chinese kowtow, prostrating himself before the emperor. But Macartney, a proud and haughty man, felt that kowtowing would be an intolerable humiliation to him and thus to his sovereign, His Majesty King George III.
The arguments went backwards and forwards. Macartney suggested, what if I take off my hat and kneel, the same as I would do to my own king? No way, came the Chinese response. For a barbarian not to kowtow to the emperor was an unthinkable insult. Very well, said Macartney, I will kowtow to the emperor if a Chinese official of the same rank as me kowtows to a portrait of King George. This was considered an idea so outrageous that Chinese officials declined even to translate it for their superiors.
I believe in good manners, and if you're going to talk to somebody, in their own way. If they want you to take your shoes off, as in Japan, you do so. If they want you to sit cross-legs, you do so. And if you want to stand up, you do so. It's no big deal. So for me, I have no problem with that. And it's rather nice to understand where they're coming from. And I said, it depends what you want to achieve. If you really want the deal to be done, you better be clever about it.
I'm not in favour of calling every foreign minister you meet Fred or Bill or Eduardo or whatever. I think that certain courtesies need to be observed, but I don't think you should ever allow yourself to be persuaded that the only definition of protocol is what the other people do.
It was diplomatic impasse. Exasperated, McCartney noted in his journal, "The Chinese character seems at present inexplicable." In perfect symmetry, Chinese officials dealing with him reported that the barbarian nature is unfathomable. As McCartney finally reached his destination, the argument over the kowtow was unresolved. The unassuming town of Zhongde is best known for the imperial mountain resort where the Qing emperors would flee the summer's heat. Unlike McCartney, I arrived in deepest winter. Emperor Qianlong was over 80 years old and in the 58th year of his reign. To the Chinese, he was the intermediary between heaven and earth. McCartney had brought with him what he thought were suitably impressive gifts, from telescopes and clocks to a hot air balloon, a dazzling display designed to wow China into opening up trade. But to Qianlong, this was but a barbarian's tribute, a sign of submission.
So much for McCartney's gifts to the Emperor. They were intended to showcase British genius and prize open a new and valuable export market. The notion of paying tribute to the Chinese Emperor never crossed the minds of red-blooded Englishmen. Mind you, diplomatic gifts have a habit of misfiring. I remember when I was in the Foreign Office, responsible for the old Soviet Union, we gave Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister, a valuable antique barometer. He looked at it in some puzzlement and then tried to play it like a balalaika.
Diplomatic gifts are a complete nightmare, particularly as they get more and more trivial, as governments have rules about the value of gifts which can be exchanged. Yet an enormous effort is still wasted on procuring them. I have a very clear memory of flying to Moscow with Margaret Thatcher to see Mr. Gorbachev, and the Foreign Office had provided the gift she was to give him. And in an idle moment, a rare idle moment on the plane, she asked to see the gift, and it was brought forward and unwrapped. And it was a pair of silver-backed hairbrushes. "But he's bald," she said. And the Foreign Office were forced to send somebody out from London with a backup present.
The night before McCartney was to meet the Emperor, he made his final preparations. But to kowtow or not to kowtow, that was the question.
McCartney's instructions from London ordered him to conform to all ceremonials of that court, which may not commit the honour of your sovereign or lessen your own dignity. But then again they said, "While I make this reserve, I am satisfied you will be too prudent and considerate to let any trifling punctilio stand in the way of the important benefits which may be obtained by engaging the favourable disposition of the Emperor and his ministers." Behind the elegant ambiguity of the Foreign Office, the message was clear. You're on your own, and you better not screw up.
Dawn came, September the 14th, 1793. McCartney and his entourage reached the imperial compound to find several thousand people gathered to celebrate the Emperor's birthday. 5,000 miles and a year since his mission had set off, it was the moment of truth. The emperor arrived on an open palanquin, carried by 16 men dressed in gold.
As the emperor passed, the Chinese crowds instantly fell prostrate to the ground in kowtow. But what did Macartney and his companions finally decide to do? They simply went down on one knee.
When he was called before the great throne, Macartney presented the emperor with some of the British gifts. This was intended to provide the opening to raising the question of trade. But Qianlong was not interested in engaging with these upstart barbarians who would not conform to court etiquette. Over the following week, every time Macartney tried to raise the business of his mission with Chinese officials, he was brushed off. Qianlong issued angry instructions.
Let us immediately order the envoy to return to Beijing. When barbarians manifest sincerity and respect, I shall unfailingly treat them with kindness. When they are full of themselves, they do not merit the enjoyment of my favors.
Macartney was sent packing in disgrace. There would be no new trade privileges, no new ports open to British merchants, no resident British ambassador. The mission was a total failure.
You can't conceive of them saying yes to Macartney's demands. After all, what did he want? He wanted not only trading posts, possibly an island as a base for trade, and above all, he wanted diplomatic relations on an equal footing. Now, this was something quite unthinkable to the Chinese. After all, there could only be one sun in the sky, and that, of course, was China.
China did not want two-way trade. It didn't mind China selling to Britain, but it didn't want Britain to come selling to China, because then he wouldn't benefit from a surplus. And therefore, I think Macartney's mission was doomed to failure, not so much of cultural differences, but total protectionism.
We had so much to offer China, whether it was elaborate clocks or rolls of cloth. Why wouldn't China want to take advantage of our friendship and our trade? To his credit, and rather unlike some later travellers to China, he refused literally and metaphorically to kowtow, and refused to leave behind his own concept of what was reasonable behaviour in dealing with the great emperor.
In the heart of London, where Britain's prosperity has always been a single-minded pursuit, is one of our oldest financial institutions, Coutts Bank. Its boardroom is lined with an exquisite wallpaper brought back from China by Macartney. Even disastrous missions can yield fine souvenirs.
I reckon that in Macartney's place, I might well have kowtowed before Qianlong, but there would have been the most almighty tussle between my head and my heart. To have abased myself before a foreigner would really have stuck in the craw. But my job as a British diplomat was, with a hard head and a cold eye, to open up trade with China, even if it meant a dent to my diplomatic dignity.
Wallpaper wasn't the only thing the ambassador brought back. For King George III, there was an edict from Emperor Qianlong.
As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures.
But the most devastating thing of all was that Qianlong's edict was drafted even before McCartney arrived in China. So the sad truth is that the ambassador never really stood a chance.
When it comes to fighting for British prosperity, serious issues can take ridiculous guises. In my time as ambassador in Washington, I spent interminable man-hours on the Great Banana War.
This was a ludicrous dispute between Europe and America about tariffs on a fruit that neither grew. The Scottish cashmere wool industry got caught in the crossfire when the Americans threatened retaliation against various European imports. Several thousand Scottish jobs were at stake. It was a serious threat to British prosperity. Ambassadors justified their existence by thwarting things like this. To succeed, I had to break ranks with my European colleagues and tell the Americans that they could do anything but lay off of my blue wool socks. Sure enough, Italian sausage and goodness knows what else were hit, while Scottish cashmere was spared. Looking out for British trade, you sometimes have to fight dirty.
Hong Kong, one of the great engines of the global economy. It's all about money, trade, display, and consumption. It's capitalism incarnate. But back in the mid-19th century, when the British first took over, it was an insignificant backwater.
When the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, heard that Hong Kong had become our latest colony, he dismissed the prize as a barren island with hardly a house upon it. It will never serve as a mart for trade. That's almost as bad as announcing the end of boom and bust.
But Palmerston's comment reveals an underlying truth about Victorian Britain's mercantilist view of empire. It is, as he put it, the business of government to open and to secure the roads for the merchant.
Half a century had passed since Macartney's failed mission, but China remained no less the object of desire for Britain's commercial ambitions. Diplomacy having failed, it was now the hour of the gunboat.
As tea continued to pour from China towards Britain, we found a new way to pay for it: smuggling opium into China from India. When China attempted to stop a trade that was turning its people into drug addicts, Britain responded with war. As a result, the Chinese were forced to open 5 ports, including Canton, to European commerce, while Britain gained a permanent base in Hong Kong. But European trade remained very restricted, and there was still no diplomatic relations between Britain and China.
Nobody could have been determined to open China to what he considered the unquestionable benefits of Western civilization than the man who from 1854 gloried in the titles of plenipotentiary and chief superintendent for trade in the Far East and governor, commander-in-chief and vice admiral of Hong Kong.
Sir John Bowring, like a number of more recent top diplomatic appointees, came straight from the benches of the House of Commons.
John Bowring was a rather loud-mouthed, long-winded radical. Definitely on the left, so they didn't use those terms then. He wrote hymns. He was an intelligent man, but very fond of the sound of his own voice. So the secret was to get him as far away as you could. And being made to be governor of Hong Kong and in charge of the arrangements at Canton for trading with China seemed to be a good way of, getting him out of Westminster, where he was a nuisance.
As a young radical, Bowring had denounced the opium trade as immoral. But out east, he changed his tune. Anything to do business with China. Yet, for his first 2 years in Hong Kong, he was frustrated at every turn. He simply couldn't crack the Chinese market.
In his letters home to headquarters in London, Baring became increasingly insistent that a more forceful policy towards China might again be needed. It is hard to get on with these stubborn mandarins, he wrote to the Foreign Office. Before the end, I am quite afraid we shall have to employ something harder than brain bullets.
Lord Palmerston agreed.
I clearly see that the time is fast coming when we shall be obliged to strike another blow in China. These half-civilized governments require a dressing every 8 or 10 years to keep them in order. And they must not only see the stick, but actually feel it on their shoulders.
Nowadays, Victorian attitudes about half-civilized peoples in need of a good thrashing are horribly jarring. But to judge Victoria's ministers by today's standards doesn't get you very far in understanding what they were about. It's a characteristic of empires at their peak to see their interests as the expression of universal values, to believe that their actions benefit all mankind. So, for Baring, Britain's ambitions in China were a progressive, even moral cause. After 60 years of frustration, there could be no question of kowtowing to China. Britain would use its naval and military might, and Britain would be right.
In 20th, 21st century terms, there was no conceivable justification for globalizing China by force and globalizing China by obliging them to purchase opium in order to help the Indian balance of payments. I mean, it was a disgraceful example of imperial aggression. So it wasn't at all defensible in modern terms.
It's no different than George W. Bush saying that he's got to spread democracy to all these places in the Middle East. His high-mindedness came from a Victorian value of believing that Britain was actually spreading good and benefit to the world.
In the event, Baring found his casus belli, though it was a pretty dubious one. On the 8th of October, 1856, Chinese officials boarded a boat called the Arrow and arrested its crew on suspicion of piracy and smuggling. The British consul in Canton demanded their release and an apology, claiming the ship was registered in Hong Kong and under British protection. In fact, the registration of the Arrow had expired, and it had been involved in piracy. But Baring ignored all this, deliberately inflaming the situation by charging the Chinese with an outrageous insult. On Baring's orders, the British Navy bombarded Canton and stormed the city. The Chinese responded by closing down all trade and setting fire to the European settlement. Commissioner Ye, governor of Canton, issued an order to his people.
The British have attacked our city, killing our soldiers and people. I now command you to fight any Briton on land or water. $30 will be rewarded to anyone who succeeds in killing one Briton and brings his head to my office.
Those were the days before an ambassador's style was cramped by instant electronic instructions from London. Not that I ever had the urge to declare war on anyone. But with instructions taking 2 months to reach Hong Kong, Baring was expected to use his initiative in a way unknown to the modern generation of diplomats. But even by Victorian standards, starting a war was a serious thing to do. And Baring started a war.
Declaring war on dodgy grounds has always tended to lead to a rumpus. When Palmerston, now Prime Minister, heard the news of Bowring's war, he took the unprecedented step of inviting the Attorney General to advise the Cabinet on its legality. There was very little doubt that Bowring's actions were against international law. But the Cabinet felt that even so, they had little choice but to back Britain's man. So they devised a dubious doctrine that international law did not apply to what they called barbarous states, especially when British trade was at stake.
While Palmerston and his supporters backed Bowring, asserting the importance of trade with China for British interests, poor old Sir John faced considerable criticism, and there were motions of censure against him in both houses of Parliament. As part of the case against China, this blue book of foreign policy documents was presented to Parliament, with the sexed-up title of Correspondence Respecting Insults in China. The critics dismissed it as a dodgy dossier and a bad excuse for war.
It came to a vote in the Commons, and the government lost. Palmerston responded by dissolving Parliament and calling a general election, dominated by the Chinese question.
This is one example of how wrong it is to say that, democracies are always in favour of peace. The people, the electorate, the middle-class electorate of 1857, backed Palmerston to the hilt. He was perfectly right, they said, to go to war and to take vengeance on this jumped-up Chinese commissioner who dared to arrest people out of a British ship. And all the politically correct people of all parties found themselves humiliated in the general election. People liked the war. People liked Palmerston. People liked the war.
Thanks very much. Patriotic fervour won out, as it does so often, against legal and moral scruple. Palmerston won a resounding election victory and a clear mandate to continue an aggressive policy towards China. But it wasn't just jingoistic xenophobia that brought the public round so strongly behind Palmerston and Bowring. They knew which side their bread was buttered.
It took 3 more years before the war with China was won. The fruits of victory were further commercial advantages and Hong Kong's expansion to include Kowloon. But most important of all, Britain got what it had always wanted: permanent diplomatic representation in Beijing. But Bowring wasn't in the Far East to see the war that he had started end in victory. He'd become too controversial, and though Palmerston's government had backed him, they thought it best he be replaced. He was disappointed, but unrepentant, writing in his autobiography,
I had, during my tenure of office, the pleasure of seeing the shipping trade increased nearly 100%. I not only made the revenue, in which there had been a great deficit, equal the expenditure, but I left a large balance in the treasury chest. I carried out the principles of free trade to their fullest possible extent.
In fact, British exports to China had risen over 5-fold during Bowring's time in Hong Kong.
You can't argue with the results. Britain emphatically got her way and reinforced the foundations of her wealth and status. Did the end justify the means, which involved the use of gunboats and opium? Well, most Victorians would have said it did. But what goes round comes round, especially in diplomacy.
With empire, as well as trade, comes responsibility. In the Madrid embassy in the early 1970s, I was responsible for Gibraltar, a small rock parked on the doorstep of a once great empire that, like Hong Kong, had fallen into British hands.
Britain has given a solemn commitment not to give Gibraltar back to Spain unless its people agree. But whenever I met with my opposite numbers in Madrid, they used to bombard me with great grievances about our alleged violations of the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713. In short, every argument they could muster why the rock should revert to Spain. We believed that we had a duty to honour the wishes of the Gibraltar people. They felt that a 260-year-old treaty was paramount. In international relations, there's no getting away from history. But unlike China, Franco's Spain didn't have the strength, military or economic, to force us to give it back. Effective diplomacy depends so often on the mailed fist inside the velvet glove.
This most singular of days began with the most typical of Hong Kong summer weather, heat and the promise of rain.
In 1997, the Union Jack was lowered on the last significant colony of the British Empire. The governor took his leave as responsibility for the city's 6.5 million people was handed back to China.
For China, this was a moment of pride. For their leaders, an end to what they call an age of shame and humiliation.
To get to this historic moment had involved some of the highest and lowest points in the Chinese-British relationship, with our diplomats seemingly veering between the two different approaches to China, the row and the kowtow. For the final 2 decades of the 20th century, trade alone could not be the chief focus of British diplomacy with China. That was Hong Kong itself. As a result of the 2 Opium Wars, Hong Kong Island and Kowloon had become permanent British territory. In 1898, the new territories were added on a 99-year lease from China, so Britain had Hong Kong on a mixture of freehold and leasehold.
This is Boundary Street, the ruler-straight dividing line between territory that belonged to Britain on that side and land leased from China on this side.
Nearly half of Hong Kong's population lived in the new territories. Our diplomats had a deadline. The lease was due to run out in 1997. But here was the rub. China wanted the whole colony back by then.
Whatever the legal position, that on the ground was very clear. The rest of Hong Kong could not remain British. We were powerless to stop the People's Liberation Army from simply crossing the road and taking over.
Hong Kong was entirely dependent on the mainland for its food and its water. The Chinese enjoyed overwhelming military superiority, so they had virtually all the cards. So merely to get into a negotiation with them about the future of Hong Kong, regardless of the outcome, was something of an achievement.
The days of gunboat diplomacy had long since gone. Now we had to rely exclusively on the skills of diplomats who didn't have a military card in their hands. But the British were not entirely without levers. After Mao, China was keen to make its way back into the world community, and Beijing certainly didn't want to kill the golden goose of Hong Kong's burgeoning capitalist economy. Yet, just as there had been between Qianlong and McCartney, there was still a gulf between the two sides. And at every turn, the baggage of history burdened the negotiations.
Well, they were very touchy, very emotional about Hong Kong. They saw it as their recovery of national territory, which had been wrested from them in humiliating circumstances in the 19th century. They also regarded us as, of course, because of their Marxist, Maoist background, as devious capitalists who would be extremely tricky to deal with in the last stages of their power.
The formal talks considered everything. Britain's interest in Hong Kong was no longer straightforwardly commercial. Its strategic goal was to preserve Hong Kong's unique way of life, including freedoms not enjoyed in mainland China.
I remember my old boss, Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe, trying to get over this idea that there was something of intrinsic value that needed to be preserved in Hong Kong. In face-to-face negotiations with the Chinese, Geoffrey suddenly got up out of his armchair, seized a nearby vase, and clutching it to his bosom, trotted across the room and handed it to the Chinese foreign minister. It was his colourful way of conveying the notion that Hong Kong's unique character required very careful handling if it were not to be smashed to pieces in the transfer of power.
Of course, for the British team, the chief bull in the China shop was Margaret Thatcher, the first Prime Minister since Lord Palmerston to win 3 successive elections, who shared with her predecessor a belligerent approach to foreign policy.
She had just emerged victorious from the Falklands War, where, as she saw it, the Foreign Office had just been stopped from giving away another bit of British territory to the foreigners, so she was in a pretty combative mood. She didn't really see the need for any concessions to the Chinese over Hong Kong. And I involved a little law of diplomacy, which I recommend to you all. I would call it Craddock's first law of diplomacy, and it reads, it's not the other side you need to worry about, it's your own.
The British negotiators tiptoed carefully through the minefield of Chinese objections.
You have to be patient. You have to wait and not always make your own proposals, not always reply at once to their proposals. The Chinese think in terms of a long time, and you have to understand that.
I think the key behind it all was the capacity to put oneself in the other side's shoes, to think more or less as they're thinking, and thereby to judge how far you can go, how far you can press, and what traffic the bridge can carry.
In December 1984, after 2 years of talks, Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher met in Beijing to sign the so-called Joint Declaration. This was a groundbreaking agreement. All of Hong Kong would revert to China in 1997, but it would keep its capitalist system, economic autonomy, and freedoms. And China would adhere to a mutually agreed basic law in Hong Kong for at least 50 years. The Chinese called this unique arrangement one country, two systems.
In 1984, on my first jaunt overseas as Foreign Office spokesman, I went with Margaret Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe to Beijing for the signing of the Joint Declaration. This was a moment in history, but I have to confess that my sharpest memories are of a chain-smoking Deng Xiaoping and his spittoon, of which he would make occasional use in conversation with Margaret Thatcher. Innocent as I then was, I happened to mention this to some of the British journalists, and I was horrified to find next day's press full of spittoon stories. But the Joint Declaration was a great achievement. Relations with China took a sharp upwards turn, and as is so often the case, when the diplomacy goes well, so goes the business.
Following the joint declaration, Chinese-British trade increased rapidly, and there were new agreements on economic and nuclear cooperation. But the honeymoon period did not last long.
The noise of gunfire rose from all over the center of Peking. It was unremitting.
Some reports say more than 2,000 civilians were killed in last night's army assault on Tiananmen Square, held for 7 weeks by students demanding greater democracy and an end to corruption.
Hopes that China was en route to becoming a more open and liberal society were shattered in June 1989. People around the world were horrified, but perhaps none more so than those in Hong Kong. 1 million took to the streets in protest.
Tiananmen Square incident in Hong Kong was hugely felt amongst the people. The mood in Hong Kong was one of unity, and they did not hold back. There was an outpouring of grief.
The burning question for everyone was, how free would Hong Kong really be when China was in charge? The British press condemned the massacre and called for the denunciation of the joint declaration.
What had previously been praised as a good, practical agreement was now seen as a dishonorable compromise, a betrayal of the Hong Kong people by devious diplomats who had succumbed to their occupational hazard of going native. I laboured in vain against charges in the press, which was full of stuff about the preemptive cringe of the Foreign Office, whose China-loving, Mandarin-speaking Mandarins had kowtowed all too easily to Chinese demands.
It's not very helpful to have discussions in terms of kowtows and cringes and grovels and similar gymnastic exercises. We were not engaged in a virility contest. What we were dealing with is a serious, long, patient negotiation in which inevitably, and particularly given the disparity in power, there had to be compromises.
Perhaps in reply to the accusations of preemptive cringe, in 1992 the man appointed to be the last governor of Hong Kong was not a professional diplomat, but like bowing before him, a politician.
We had agreed in the joint declaration that we were going to negotiate even more closely as we got closer to the handover. So really, it was difficult to see what a politician could add. A diplomat, an official, would stay within that framework that had been laid down. With a politician, I thought he would be more of an unknown quantity. He would know inevitably less about the scene. He might want to make his mark, want to strike out in new ways. So I advised against a politician, but I was overruled.
We foresaw, rightly, that there would be all kinds of political problems in Hong Kong and between Hong Kong and China, which would need handling politically. There would be great interest in the House of Commons. You needed to have someone with a political background. And so that decision we'd taken, even before Chris Patten became, as it were, available. It took some persuading of him, but we managed it. I remember a Sunday night supper in my flat in Carlton Gardens, where we wrestled with him over the scrambled egg. But he eventually agreed to do it, and I think that turned out very well.
Chris Patten was determined to take a tougher line with China.
I did feel strongly that I had responsibilities to do what Parliament had told would be done, and that I had responsibilities to behave as well for the people of Hong Kong as I could. My principal responsibilities weren't to go on having a good relationship with my distinguished Chinese opposite numbers to whom I could speak Mandarin.
The focus of his plans for reform was the Legislative Council, or LegCo, the closest Hong Kong gets to a parliament.
As elsewhere in the empire, colonial Hong Kong was far from democratic. The priority had been the simple march of business. Even in the 1990s, the governor was a kind of benign despot. But in handing over Hong Kong's people to Chinese autocracy, Britain had belatedly decided that representational democracy mattered. The Joint Declaration and the Basic Law had therefore provided for LegCo to have some directly elected members. A modest 18 out of 60. Chris Patten decided that this was simply not good enough.
I owe it to the community to make my own position plain. I have spent my entire career engaged in a political system based on representative democracy. My goal is simply this: to safeguard Hong Kong's way of life. So the pace of democratization in Hong Kong is, we all know, necessarily constrained. But it is constrained, not stopped dead in its tracks. Standing still is not an available option.
Patten's plans went down well with the Hong Kong public and the press. But Beijing was absolutely furious, not only at the content of the speech, but at the public way in which it had been made without consultation with China. The Chinese felt this contradicted everything that had been agreed in the Joint Declaration. It reeked of British treachery. As some would see it, we had moved in a matter of weeks from kowtow back to confrontation.
I had a lot of sympathy for Patten. It's almost impossible to argue against democracy. But diplomacy, like politics, is the art of the possible. And what Chris Patten wanted wasn't possible because the Chinese didn't want it. And there wasn't a damn thing that we could do about it except to irritate them to no good purpose. Chris Patten's outspokenness on behalf of democratic values was in many ways admirable, but it forfeited the trust of China. In the end, his epitaph must be to paraphrase the comment of the French general on the charge of the Light Brigade. C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la diplomatie.
The through train of cooperation with China had hit the buffers. Heaping public insults on his head, China refused to have any further dealings with Patten for the rest of his time as governor.
The Joint Declaration and the Basic Law were absolutely clear about the broad parameters of democratic development and defense of human rights, civil liberties, independent courts, and so on. And nobody, however, had specified exactly what the democratic arrangement should be. What I refused to do was to connive at democratic arrangements which gutted democracy.
The press boiled it down really to a mantra, which ran, I think, democracy good, Patten good, diplomats bad, China very bad. And they tended to present the situation as one of war between Britain and China, in which any attempt at compromise, any suggestion that we might settle this, that, or the other in a normal way was regarded as appeasement.
We had a lot of arguments in this country with some people who thought with trade with China was really much the most important thing. We wouldn't put that at risk. And other people who, in a rather nebulous sort of way, thought we were losing Chinese goodwill. We did lose Chinese goodwill for the time being. There was a risk, but it's all come back.
Can anybody with a modicum of common sense believe that China wishing to trade with Britain over things that they wanted, or to sell things to Britain, that they would actually not do so because of the inconsequential governorship of a lowly minister in a faraway dot in the Chinese empire? I don't think so.
For the 5 years Chris Patten was governor, Britain and China remained at loggerheads over Hong Kong. Reform of LegCo went ahead, but come 1997, Beijing, as it had warned, undid it all. Today, Hong Kong's people, for better or worse, are back in China. And China has once again allowed democracy for LegCo to inch forward.
What's the real way of judging whether dear old Sir Percy was right or whether I'm right? What's Hong Kong like today? Hong Kong has been fantastically successful. It's one of the very freest cities, societies in Asia. It still has all the hardware of a free society and software, except it doesn't have as much democracy as one would like. But there have been hundreds of thousands of people on the streets asking for more. Now, if we'd simply done what China wanted before 97, would Hong Kong have been as stable? Would Hong Kong have been as prosperous afterwards? Would Hong Kong have been as prosperous and free today? Rather doubt it.
How to handle our relationship with China remains one of the key questions of British foreign policy. In many ways, we still believe, like Adam Smith, McCartney, Palmerston, and Bowring before us, that there's an inextricable link between economics and political freedom. So, increasing economic ties with China may well be not only good for British prosperity, but also the best way of integrating China into the international community. But while human rights are still being abused, diplomacy must tread carefully.
The secret is not to conceal your disapproval, not to say it was absolutely right to shoot those students in Tiananmen Square, or it's absolutely right to treat the Dalai Lama as you do, but to make your views known without actually screwing up your dealings with China, in this case, on matters where you really actually need to reach agreement with them. This is what Obama has the same problem today in dealing with the People's Republic. It's a continuous problem in diplomacy. And diplomacy exists partly in order to find a way through this kind of contrast.
These days, China is a vitally important market for British goods and services, and we strongly encourage Chinese inward investment into the UK. The boot is truly on the other foot, as McCartney and Bowring must be observing with some astonishment from their cloud in the sky. But some things never change. Now, as then, money talks, and for the most part, drowns out those who espouse human rights in Tibet and in China itself.
Can there be an ethical foreign policy? In the final programme, I'll explore the conflict between values and what's known as realpolitik, a conflict which has tormented the history of our diplomacy.
Don't live under this dream that the West is going to come in and sort this problem out. Don't dream dreams.
There's more information on the inside story of British diplomacy in this book to accompany the series. And the Corridors of Power season continues on Thursday at 9 with the great offices of state. Next tonight, stay with us for brand new Storyville.